There comes a moment in life when pain no longer feels like an enemy, but like a messenger that has already delivered its final letter. Until that moment, we believe suffering arrives from the outside, through people, events, betrayal, loss. We say, they hurt me, life did this to me, the world is cruel. But what truly wounds us is not what happens, but what it touches inside us. Pain survives only where something within us remains unseen. Every hurt you have ever carried found a doorway inside you. Not because you were weak, but because a part of you was waiting to be acknowledged. Rejection wounds the part that doubts its worth. Abandonment awakens the forgotten child who once learned that love could disappear. Criticism strikes the hidden voice that already condemns itself. The world merely presses the bruise, it does not create it. Once you see this, something profound shifts. When you stop running from your inner darkness, it loses its power to ambush you. What is faced no longer attacks. What is understood no longer controls. You realize that people cannot harm what they cannot reach, and they can only reach what you have refused to claim as your own. This is the moment sovereignty begins. You stop demanding that the world be gentle, because you have become strong in the only place that matters. You stop begging others to treat you differently, because their behavior no longer defines your inner weather. Praise does not inflate you. Criticism does not shatter you. Love is welcome, but no longer needed for survival. This does not make you cold, it makes you whole. Wholeness is not perfection. It is the courage to contain contradictions, light and shadow, confidence and fear, strength and vulnerability. When you no longer exile parts of yourself, no one else can use them against you. Manipulation fails. Gaslighting collapses. Emotional hooks lose their grip. And then something extraordinary happens. You still feel pain, but it does not pierce. You still experience loss, but it does not hollow you out. You still encounter cruelty, but it does not infect your spirit. Hurt may pass through you, but it no longer lives inside you. At this stage, nobody and nothing can truly hurt you again, not because the world has changed, but because you are no longer fighting life. You are no longer resisting yourself. And in that union, pain loses its throne. Pain does not originate in the moment something happens to us. It is born in the place where that moment meets an unhealed part of the psyche. Two people can experience the same event, rejection, loss, criticism, yet one is shaken to the core while the other remains steady. This difference reveals an uncomfortable truth. Events do not carry pain by themselves. They merely awaken what already exists beneath the surface. What hurts is not the experience, but the meaning it attaches itself to inside us. Unresolved inner wounds are formed early, often silently. They arise from moments when understanding was absent, when emotions were dismissed, when love felt conditional, or when safety was uncertain. These impressions do not disappear with time. They sink inward and shape perception. Later in life, the outer world unknowingly touches these sensitive points. A careless word feels like betrayal. Distance feels like abandonment. Failure feels like proof of unworthiness. The present moment becomes a stage upon which the past reenacts itself. The mind prefers to blame the external because it feels safer than looking inward. Pointing to people or circumstances creates the illusion of control. If they change, the pain will stop. Yet the same patterns repeat with different faces and settings, revealing that the source has never truly been outside. Until the inner wound is acknowledged, life will continue to bring situations that mirror it. Not as punishment, but as an invitation to awareness. These wounds persist because they were once protective. They formed as strategies for survival, ways to adapt, to belong, to avoid further harm. Over time, however, what once protected begins to imprison. The individual grows, but the wound remains frozen in an earlier emotional age. When triggered, it reacts with the intensity of the moment it was created, not the maturity of the present self. This is why pain can feel overwhelming and irrational, as though something far larger than the situation has taken hold. Healing begins when responsibility replaces blame. This does not mean excusing harm or denying reality. It means recognizing where power truly resides. When attention turns inward, the wound is no longer an invisible force directing reactions. It becomes something seen, felt, and gradually understood. Awareness loosens its grip. Compassion softens its edges. What was once an open wound becomes a scar, still present but no longer bleeding. As inner wounds are integrated rather than avoided, external ends lose their authority. The same experiences still occur, but they no longer define the inner state. Disappointment is felt without collapse. Conflict is faced without self-erasure. Pain becomes information rather than identity. The world stops being an enemy and becomes a mirror, reflecting not weakness but growth in progress. What remains unconscious does not disappear. It operates silently, shaping thoughts, reactions, and emotional patterns from behind the scenes. The mind believes it is acting freely, yet much of what feels like choice is guided by unseen forces within. These hidden elements do not announce themselves openly. They surface indirectly through sudden anger, irrational fear, deep shame, or repeated attraction to the same painful situations. The harm does not come from their existence, but from their invisibility. The unconscious gains power precisely because it is ignored. When an inner conflict is not acknowledged, it seeks expression in disguised forms. Suppressed grief may appear as numbness. Repressed anger may emerge as bitterness or self-sabotage. Unaccepted vulnerability may harden into control or emotional distance. Because these expressions feel automatic, the individual assumes they are part of personality rather than messages from something unresolved. In this way, the unconscious directs behavior while remaining safely hidden from examination. Much of this material originates early, when awareness was limited and language insufficient to process experience. Feelings that could not be understood were pushed out of conscious attention, not eliminated but stored. Over time, these fragments form patterns that influence how reality is interpreted. The present is filtered through the unresolved past. A neutral event can feel threatening, a minor rejection can feel devastating, and a small failure can feel like total collapse. The intensity comes not from the moment itself, but from the accumulated weight beneath it. What is unconscious also shapes relationships. People are often chosen not for who they are, but for what they activate internally. Old wounds seek familiar environments, hoping for resolution. Yet without awareness, the same dynamics repeat. The individual feels victimized by others, unaware that an unseen inner script is being followed. This repetition continues until the hidden material is brought into the light of consciousness. Awareness is not about judgment or self-criticism. It is an act of honesty. When something is named, it loses its ability to dominate from the shadows. Emotions that are felt fully no longer need to express themselves through distortion. Thoughts that are examined lose their compulsive authority. The unconscious does not resist awareness, it seeks it. What was once dangerous becomes informative. What once attacked becomes communicative. As consciousness expands, the inner world becomes less chaotic. Reactions slow, choices widen. The individual begins to respond rather than react. Pain still arises, but it no longer feels mysterious or overwhelming. It becomes a signal pointing inward, guiding attention to what needs integration. The more that is made conscious, the less power remains hidden. In this way, awareness transforms suffering into understanding, and understanding gradually restores inner balance. Inner darkness gains control only when it is denied. What we refuse to look at does not vanish, it waits. It watches from the edges of awareness and intervenes when we are least prepared. Fear, jealousy, rage, shame, and resentment become most destructive when they are disowned, because then they act without guidance or restraint. Avoidance gives these forces autonomy, allowing them to shape behavior while remaining unrecognized as parts of the self. Facing inner darkness is not an act of indulgence, but of courage. It requires standing still in the presence of uncomfortable truths, without rushing to explain them away or cover them with positivity. The mind often resists this encounter, fearing that acknowledgement will lead to collapse or moral failure. In reality, the opposite is true. Darkness that is seen becomes limited. It is no longer infinite, no longer monstrous. It takes shape, and what has shape can be understood. When a person turns toward what they fear within, the dynamic shifts from possession to relationship. Instead of being overtaken by anger, one can recognize it as a response to unmet boundaries. Instead of being consumed by envy, one can see a neglected desire. Instead of drowning in shame, one can uncover a wound that once required concealment to survive. These emotions lose their compulsive grip because they are no longer fighting for recognition. They are being listened to. Control fades as integration begins. Integration does not mean acting out darkness or justifying harmful impulses. It means accepting their existence without letting them dictate behavior. Acknowledged darkness becomes conscious energy that can be directed, rather than a chaotic force that erupts unpredictably. This process restores choice. The individual is no longer driven by reactions they do not understand, but guided by awareness that allows pause, reflection, and intentional response. Facing inner darkness also dissolves projection. When denied parts of the self remain hidden, they are often seen in others and judged harshly. What is rejected internally becomes intolerable externally. As these parts are reclaimed, the need to attack or defend diminishes. Compassion grows, not as weakness, but as clarity. The world appears less threatening because the internal battlefield has quieted. With time, the darkness reveals its original purpose. Many of these traits formed as adaptations to protect vulnerability in moments when safety was absent. Recognizing this transforms hostility into understanding. What once felt like an enemy becomes a guardian that stayed too long after the danger had passed. Gratitude replaces fear, and authority returns to the conscious self. By facing inner darkness, its rule comes to an end. It no longer governs behavior from the shadows. It becomes part of a larger, more complete whole, contributing depth rather than destruction. In this union, the individual gains inner stability that does not depend on external conditions, because nothing hidden remains to seize control. Emotional independence begins when a person no longer relies on others to regulate their sense of worth, safety, or identity. As long as approval, validation, or reassurance is required from the outside, the inner world remains open to influence. Manipulation thrives in this dependency. It enters through unmet needs, unspoken fears, and the silent hope that someone else will provide what feels missing within. Where emotional survival depends on another, power is easily transferred. Manipulation does not always appear as force or cruelty. Often it is subtle, disguised as affection, authority, or concern. It works by promising relief from discomfort or by threatening withdrawal of connection. Guilt, fear, abandonment, and the desire to be seen are common entry points. When emotions are outsourced, reactions become predictable. The individual can be steered not because they are weak, but because they are unfinished in their self-reliance. Emotional independence does not mean isolation or detachment. It means the ability to experience emotions fully without being overtaken by them or needing immediate external resolution. When feelings are owned rather than projected, they lose their volatility. Disapproval no longer shatters identity. Silence no longer feels like rejection. Conflict no longer signals the end of connection. This internal steadiness removes the levers that manipulators rely on. As independence grows, the internal dialogue shifts. Instead of asking, "What will they think of me?" the question becomes, "What am I experiencing right now?" Attention turns inward. This awareness creates space between stimulus and response. In that space, manipulation fails. Emotional hooks cannot catch when there is no urgency to escape discomfort. The individual can tolerate uncertainty, tension, and temporary disapproval without collapsing into compliance. Boundaries naturally strengthen as emotional independence develops. They no longer feel like defenses built from fear, but expressions of self-respect. Saying no does not require justification. Agreement is chosen, not coerced. The need to explain, appease, or prove diminishes. This clarity often unsettles those who benefited from emotional dependence, but it restores balance and dignity to relationships. With independence comes discernment. Words are evaluated against actions. Flattery loses its intoxicating effect. Threats lose their weight. Emotional reactions from others are no longer internalized as personal responsibility. Each person is allowed ownership of their own inner state. This separation is not coldness, it is psychological maturity. Over time, emotional independence creates a quiet authority. The individual becomes less reactive, less predictable, and therefore less controllable. Manipulation depends on urgency and confusion. Independence brings patience and clarity. In this state, influence must be earned through honesty rather than extracted through pressure. The individual remains open, connected, and compassionate, but no longer accessible through emotional weakness. Power returns to where it belongs, within. Wholeness is not the absence of darkness, but the capacity to hold it alongside light without division. The mind often seeks purity, imagining growth as the elimination of undesirable traits and the preservation of only what appears noble or acceptable. Yet this pursuit fragments the self. By identifying exclusively with kindness, strength, or virtue, Everything that contradicts that image is pushed away. What is rejected does not disappear. It becomes the shadow, operating outside conscious awareness and demanding expression in indirect and often destructive ways. Light represents the qualities we value and present to the world. Shadow contains impulses, emotions, and tendencies that feel incompatible with that identity. Anger, envy, desire, fear, and vulnerability are commonly exiled, not because they are inherently harmful, but because they threaten the image the self is trying to maintain. This split creates inner conflict. Energy is spent suppressing parts of the psyche rather than understanding them. The result is tension, exhaustion, and a persistent sense of incompleteness. Integration begins when judgment is replaced by curiosity. Instead of asking why a certain trait should not exist, awareness turns toward what purpose it once served. Many shadow aspects formed as responses to real experiences. Aggression may have developed to protect boundaries. Control may have arisen from chaos. Withdrawal may have ensured safety when expression was punished. Seen through this lens, the shadow reveals intelligence rather than corruption. It carries information about unmet needs and unfinished development. As light and shadow are brought into dialogue, inner conflict softens. The individual no longer needs to perform goodness while secretly battling resentment, nor display strength while hiding fear. Authenticity emerges not from perfection, but from coherence. Contradictions are allowed to coexist without canceling each other out. Compassion gains depth because it is informed by an understanding of human complexity. Strength becomes grounded because it acknowledges vulnerability rather than denying it. When shadow is integrated, projection diminishes. Traits that once provoked intense reactions in others lose their charge. Judgment softens because the same impulses are recognized internally. This does not excuse harmful behavior, but it replaces moral rigidity with psychological realism. Boundaries remain, but they are no longer fueled by fear of contamination from what has been denied within. Wholeness creates stability. The individual is less reactive because fewer parts are fighting for recognition. Emotional swings lessen as inner extremes find balance. Creativity expands, drawing energy from both discipline and instinct. Relationships become more honest because there is less need to hide or defend. Self feels solid, not because it is flawless, but because it is complete. By integrating both light and shadow, the psyche regains unity. Nothing essential is left outside the circle of awareness. In this state, growth is no longer a battle against oneself, but a process of continual inclusion, where every aspect of experience contributes to depth, resilience, and inner peace. Invulnerability is often mistaken for numbness, detachment, or the ability to avoid situations that might cause pain. This belief creates a life organized around escape from conflict, from vulnerability, from emotions that feel overwhelming or unsafe. Yet avoidance does not protect, it postpones. What is avoided gains intensity, returning in subtler and more disruptive forms. True invulnerability does not come from building walls around the self, but from knowing what lives inside those walls. Self-understanding begins with the willingness to observe one's inner world without immediately trying to change it. Thoughts, emotions, impulses, and fears are allowed to surface without judgment. This act alone weakens their power. When something is fully seen, it no longer needs to announce itself through extremes. Fear that is acknowledged becomes caution. Anger that is understood becomes clarity. Sadness that is felt becomes depth rather than despair. Awareness transforms raw emotion into usable information. Avoidance fragments the psyche. Parts of the self that are deemed unacceptable are pushed away, leaving blind spots in awareness. These blind spots become points of vulnerability. When life touches them, the reaction is disproportionate and disorienting. The individual feels ambushed, as though pain arrived without warning. In truth, it entered through a place that had been left undefended by understanding. What is not known cannot be protected. As self-understanding deepens, emotional resilience grows. This resilience is not hardness, but flexibility. The individual can bend without breaking because there is familiarity with inner states. Discomfort no longer signals danger, it signals attention. Pain no longer threatens identity. It becomes an experience that passes through a stable core. External events lose their ability to define the inner world because that world is no longer mysterious or feared. Understanding also dissolves the need for constant control. Many defensive behaviors arise from the fear of being overwhelmed by emotions. When those emotions are known and trusted, control relaxes. The individual becomes open without being exposed, sensitive without being fragile, Boundaries become clear because they are informed by self-knowledge rather than fear of harm. This inner clarity changes relationships. Manipulation loses effectiveness because emotional triggers are recognized. Criticism loses its sting because self-evaluation is internal rather than outsourced. Rejection loses its terror because self-worth is no longer conditional. The individual remains receptive to feedback and connection, but no longer dependent on them for stability. True invulnerability is quiet. It does not announce itself through dominance or withdrawal. It appears as presence under pressure, honesty in discomfort, and steadiness amid uncertainty. Life continues to bring challenges, losses, and change, but they no longer penetrate to the core. Not because the core is hidden, but because it is known. In knowing oneself, nothing essential is left unguarded, and in that completeness, the self becomes resilient in a way avoidance could never achieve. Here is a suitable, calm, and powerful ending that ties all the ideas together and leaves a deep psychological aftertaste. Quiet strength, not trauma. And when you finally understand yourself, when nothing inside you is denied, exiled, or feared, you stop fighting the world. Pain may still knock, but it finds no open wound. Darkness may still appear, but it no longer rules from the shadows. Others may try to move you, shape you, or define you, yet nothing essential can be taken from you. This is not because life becomes gentle, but because you become whole. You no longer need to escape, harden, or hide. You stand where you are, complete, aware, and present. In that state, no person holds power over your inner world, and no circumstance can turn you against yourself. And this is the quiet truth. When you fully know yourself, nobody and nothing can truly hurt you again.